paper. So these are tips and strategies that you can use for your work as well as when you're peer editing your classmates. So tips for effective proofreading include things like limiting distractions while you're proofreading. Even though a lot of us are used to multitasking, your brain really does kind of struggle to concentrate on more than one thing at a time. So I suggest you go to a quiet place where you don't have any distractions. I also suggest reading the paper out loud. This engages a different part of our brain. Sometimes when we read our own work silently, our brain is really kind to us, and it just glosses over the errors that we have because it's like, I know what you meant, don't worry about it. But reading it out loud is a good strategy for picking up on those errors. I also suggest that you read the paper backwards. So start at your conclusion, look at that. Is that a solid paragraph? Does it have everything you need in there? Is it 5 to 10 sentences with one cohesive topic? And then go to the paragraph above that and look at that paragraph. Is it a solid paragraph? And then work your way all the way back to the introduction. I also really suggest having a friend proofread your paper. The more eyes that you get on your work, the better. And then if you can, have that friend read your paper out loud to you, because just like you reading your paper out loud engages a different part of your brain, listening to somebody else read your paper out loud does something else in your brain as well, and you might hear things that sound a little bit different than you intended. When you read your work, read for words, not meaning. And I know that that sounds a little crazy, but what I want you to do is go through your paper slowly, look at your spelling, look at each word. Did you use the correct form of there? Is everything positioned the way that it should be in terms of sentence structure? This just helps distance you from your text and can help you spot errors. Some people even use a ruler when they proofread or cut a small square in a piece of paper so that they're sure that they're only looking at one line or one word at a time. Don't rely on spell check. Now, notice that I did not say don't use spell check. You absolutely must use spell check. But, spell checkers and grammar checkers, they are tools that are meant to help us, but they're not foolproof. So always evaluate their suggestions. And we all know how to use spell checker on Word. If you are not already using an online grammar checker, then you definitely should be doing that as well. There's some links for some grammar checkers in the resource folder in our Blackboard shell, but my favorite one is Grammarly. Now, let's look at some common grammar mistakes that students make. So, typos. Typos pop up a lot in everybody's writing. Just make sure that you look for them, check each sentence for typos. This is the type of thing that spell checker is not going to pick up on all the time. So please, please, please go back and read each sentence, each word, checking for typos. Also, look at agreement, verb tense agreement. So, for example, in the sentence, she was arranging flowers and talks on her phone. We see in this sentence that the first verb is past tense and the second verb is present tense, and that just doesn't work in the same sentence. Or things like the women shoots basketball. Obviously, that is not an agreement either because women is plural, but shoots is a singular verb. So you just want to make sure that you're sticking with the same verb tense all throughout your essay and that each sentence is correct. I also want you to watch for fragments. Ask yourself, does every sentence have a subject and a verb? If it doesn't, the sentence is a fragment. Sometimes the sentence makes sense anyways. This mainly applies in creative writing, but even then, you want to ask yourself, does the sentence logically follow from the preceding sentence or serve as a logical introduction to another one? So an example of an effective fragment would be, does the bird fly slowly? Absolutely. So absolutely isn't technically a complete sentence, but it works because of the introduction. Now, here's a fragment, and now for something completely different. If you're introducing a new topic or something like that, that could also work. But like I said, mainly the place that you're going to see fragment usage that's appropriate is going to be in more creative things. If you are writing an academic essay, not like a narrative essay, not a reflection essay, but something like a research paper, then you don't want to use fragments. Okay, the dreaded comma. Commas are tricky, but they can be a very efficient tool in your writing. If you have questions about commas, there are so many grammar resources out there that can help you. But one of the things that students do quite a bit is they put lots of commas in their paper because they're like, I don't know what should be here. I'm just going to throw in a comma. So you always want to check that there are the appropriate number of commas. The other thing that students sometimes like to do is not use any commas, like in this third point right here. Commas can also be underused, like in this sentence, and because the thoughts are not being effectively broken up, this can add frustration, especially for your reader, because they're like, whoa, that was a lot of information with no breaks. For more help with commas, there are comma resources in the grammar resource list on board. Okay, let's talk about pronouns for just a second. In academic writing, you do not want to use first or second person. So first person is going to be things like I, me, my. Second person is going to be things like you, your, or yours. Instead of saying I believe global warming is an important issue, academic essays just work better if you just say something like global warming is an important issue. So take these pronouns out of academic papers. Now, when you're writing something like a narrative essay where you are telling your story, pronouns are completely appropriate, but not in academic papers. Okay, so let's talk about wordiness. If a sentence is longer than 3 lines and has not been carefully structured, it's probably too wordy. You definitely want to try for crisp, clean, concise thoughts, not stream of consciousness. So a good way to kind of check for wordiness is look at the logical flow. So something like, if your sentences flow logically into each other, you probably are not going to be overly wordy, unless you write as well as Thomas Jefferson, which I very much doubt. So the question, is the preceding sentence wordy? Definitely. Kind of my rule of thumb is if you have to reread something, it can probably be written better. So another tip or trick that I like to have my students do is to circle every punctuation mark when you are looking at your essay. This does a couple of things. First of all, it will show you, what is the general length of your sentence. If you realize you have 4 sentences that take up an entire page, you probably have some run-on sentences or wordiness going on there. If you have 10 commas in one sentence, you definitely know that something needs to be rewritten, unless it's like a list. So this helps you kind of pinpoint those issues. It helps you look at approximately how many sentences are in each paragraph, things like that. So one of the times that you read through your paper, I definitely want you to circle every punctuation mark. Change the look of your document. Almost everything that we read has a white background and black letters. So when you read that, your brain thinks like, oh, I totally got this. I know how to do it. But if you change things up, if you give it a dark background with white letters, then all of a sudden your brain is like, whoa, hold on just a second. I need to take another moment to process that. And that slowing down is actually going to help you spot more errors. There's also fonts that specifically help people with dyslexia or dysgraphia. And so if using one of those fonts to write or proofread your essay helps you, definitely do that. You'll want to change it back to MLA format before you submit it, but you can definitely proofread in that font. When I am proofreading my own work, I like to print things out like triple or quadruple space, so it gives me lots of room between the lines to add lots of notes and suggestions and stuff like that. So that's something else that you can do to help with your proofreading and editing. Okay, I always tell students proofread for one kind of error at a time. So don't take on too much. There's no way that you can look at all of it at one time. So the first thing that I want you to do after you finish writing your paper is print it off and then do a first read through and then think about what really needs work. Do we want to look at fluency? Do we want to look at transitions? Do we want to look at spelling and grammar? Things like that. Pick one of those things and start with that. Now, if you decide that you're going to start with fluency, but your brain is like, ooh, misspelled that, ooh, misspelled that, oh, misspelled that, then probably what your brain is telling you is let's look at spelling and grammar first, and then go back and work on something like fluency. You also want to check for content and academic convention. This means, does your paper follow the rules of the class? Is the content appropriate for your assignment? And where a lot of students get messed up on this issue is, so for example, they're asked to write one type of essay, like maybe an informative essay, but instead what they turn in, it more closely resembles an argumentative essay. So you just want to make sure that what you're being asked to write matches what you're turning in. If you have an argument, you want to make sure you supported it with appropriate research. Is your voice appropriate and your vocabulary choice appropriate? So you probably will use different language in a narrative essay than you would in a book report. So you just kind of want to be aware of those things. And then, are there any phrases that you use that don't add to the meaning of your essays? We use a lot of colloquialisms and idioms in the American language, and so a lot of times they just end up in our writing, but sometimes they don't actually belong there. So this is particularly useful if you are working with a strict word count. And then you want to look at the organizational structure of the paper. Do you have a thesis statement? Is your thesis statement well developed and supported? Does the conclusion sort of tie up loose ends by revisiting the introduction? And does your writing follow an appropriate academic structure? Usually there's an introduction, there's some body paragraphs, there's a conclusion. So you just kind of want to make sure that everything is structured correctly. For the essays in my class, I will tell you specifically, this is the information that you want in your introduction, this is the information that you want in your body, and this is the information that you want in your conclusions. And, you know, all of those will be separate paragraphs or sections. You also want to look at the transitions that you are using, and this is something that we'll talk more about in the future, but essentially, are there clear transition sentences between your paragraphs? Do your sentences transition into one another? And does your paper flow, or does it feel blocky. If this is something that you really struggle with before we get to transitions in the course, this is definitely something that we can work on one-on-one, because a lot of times there's just, little tweaks that you can make in your transitions that make everything feel smoother in your paper. You also want to look at your formatting, check the formatting. Different classes use different types of formatting. APA, MLA, or Turabian are the three most popular. So if you're taking a history class, for example, you may be using APA. In all of your English or composition courses, we're going to be using MLA. So just remember to check sort of the formatting around your particular style. So these are things like the margins, 1 inch on every side, the headings and the headers, your citations, your font, and font size. And please don't try to cheat with things like your font size or your margins. 11 or 12 is an appropriate font size. If you turn in a paper that's 15, so you met the page requirement, it doesn't really work. And then one of the last things that you always want to check is your citations. You never want to turn in a paper with somebody else's words not properly cited. So make sure if you use an idea or words from an outside source, it is cited. Make sure your quotations are laid out correctly. Make sure your reference list or your works cited page is complete. Make sure you have the same number of sources in your essay as on your works cited page. And then make sure that the period is outside of the parentheses. And if you have no idea what this means because we haven't gone over MLA citations, that's completely fine. That is coming up in one of our next classes. Okay, now that you have all these great techniques and strategies, you know how to edit your paper or to peer edit a classmate, I suggest you figure out what steps in this process work best for you and create a checklist. So did it work better for you to look at things like content and fluency first, or did it work better for you to look at things like spelling and grammar first? Do you edit better on the computer or on paper? So by figuring those things out, you can make your own little proofreading checklist that's customized completely to you, and then just keep it with you on your phone or your laptop or something like that. And the next time you need to edit a paper, you have a checklist ready to go so that you don't forget any of the steps in the process.